before the weekend. My name is Alysa McCall, and I work for an organization called Polar Bears International, and I'm a staff scientist there as well as the director of conservation outreach. So I've been very lucky to be able to work with polar bears for almost 9 years now. It's been a really exciting time and really interesting. Polar bears are a very cool animal, which I hope you agree with since you signed up for this event today. I have a few slides I'm going to go through. I just wanted to touch on some basics of polar bears and then talk to you a little bit about what my organization is doing for polar bears and highlight a couple research projects that we're involved in, because I think it's pretty cool to learn about how we learn about polar bears and why they're important. Most importantly, I would really love to take questions from anyone at any time. Even if I'm speaking, telling you about a slide, I'll keep an eye on the questions just in case something relevant comes in and I can touch on it right away. But definitely afterwards as well, I would love to answer questions. So I've got about 20 minutes of content and then would love to chat with you about bears and can just keep rambling if we need to. So with that, I will get started. So here we go. I just wanted to show you where I'm coming from today. So I live in Yellowknife in the Northwest Territories of Canada. So I do live where it's quite cold and icy, but there are no polar bears here because I'm not close enough to the Arctic Ocean water. So I'm very cold, but no bears, which is probably a good thing. Here, but this is how I started my career. I started in biology studying mice, of all things. So there's not one straight or single path to polar bears. There's people from all sorts of backgrounds. I was just really interested in wildlife, and these deer mice in the grasslands of British Columbia I thought were super interesting. I put little radio collars on them and tracked them up and down the hills to find out where they were making their homes, and we were manipulating their habitat to see what was going on. So deer mice, they don't live very long and they reproduce really quickly, and their habitat is changeable. So we were doing things like planting more grass. I was adding water in certain areas. We were looking at changing cattle grazing impacts and looking at things like putting fences up. And all those different effects could change the habitat quickly, and we could see quickly a change in the mouse populations because they're reproducing all summer long, multiple litters. So this type of animal, if you need to step in for some reason, or if you're concerned, there's things you can do for animals like this. For polar bears, it's a little bit different. So I started studying polar bears, like I said, about 9 years ago after the deer mice, so it was quite a big jump. And polar bears, of course, are a very special animal. All animals are special, but you know, they're pretty unique. So I went up to the Arctic and started working with the bears. Much bigger, of course. The males can be easily, 1,300 pounds, females 500 pounds, something like that. And they live in a really cold and a really dynamic habitat. So very different, and it's not a habitat that we can just change whenever we want. And polar bears live a long time. They live, females live into their early mid-20s, and males live into their late teens or early 20s. They beat each other up pretty good, so they usually live not quite as long. And they reproduce quite slowly. So females only have cubs about once every 3 years, and then only maybe 1 or 2 at a time. And not all of those cubs usually make it to adulthood. So this is an animal that changes really slowly, even though their habitat is changing quickly, and we can't do anything immediately about the habitat. So this is an animal that we need to be really proactively conserving, and that's why we're talking about them now, even though they are not currently endangered, but they are threatened by the loss of habitat. So polar bears need sea ice, and if you do not remember anything else today, that's okay, but please remember polar bears do rely on sea ice. This is their habitat. This is their home. This is where they make their living and where they've adapted to survive. Polar bears use sea ice to travel on. They travel huge distances. They cover a home range, so the area they live in it can be 500,000 square kilometers, so pretty big. They use a lot of area, and that's sea ice. They mate on the sea ice. They sometimes den on the sea ice and have their babies on the ice. They absolutely need it, but the main reason that they need sea ice is for food. So polar bears have adapted to eat seal blubber as their main source of food. So you can call them a carnivore, but some of us like to call them even a lipovore because they really rely on fat or lipids to eat and survive. And that's because blubber has a crazy amount of calories. It is one of the most calorie-dense foods that you can find in the world. And polar bears have come to rely on insane amounts of energy to get them through living in the Arctic. I don't know if any of you have ever been cold before or maybe live somewhere cold, but your body kind of just feels like it wants more energy in the cold. And polar bears live just in some of the coldest places on Earth across the Arctic. They are moving a lot. They burn a lot of energy. We learned more about polar bear metabolism last year, and we realized that they burn much more energy than we even estimated, which is crazy. And they're the biggest land carnivore, biggest lipivore, the biggest animal you find on land in the world. And so that size requires food, and food in the form of blubber. Now, yes, they can maybe find food elsewhere, but they need the sea ice to access the seals because seals like to swim and they're very good swimmers. And even though polar bears are also good swimmers, they're not as good as seals. So polar bears cannot just go into the water and outswim a seal and make a living that way effectively. They really use the platform of ice to sneak up on seals that are resting, like the ones here. Or, because seals, of course, need to breathe air, seals maintain breathing holes. Each seal maintains maybe 4 or 5 breathing holes and will choose different holes throughout the day to go up and breathe. A polar bear will sit by a seal breathing hole very patiently, sometimes for a whole day without moving. And when the seal comes up for air, the polar bear will dive through the seal hole and try to pull that seal out of the hole. So they really do rely on the ice being there and to get them out onto the top of the ocean around where the seals are living. So absolutely, sea ice is number one. Seal blubber is number one for polar bears. Okay, this brings us back to that ice. What do we do about this ice? We can't put a fence around this. We can't just grow more of it whenever we want. Hiring game wardens obviously won't work. What are they going to do? This is really a global issue, and it's one of the reasons that the conservation of polar bears is so interesting to me. It is really something that everyone can be a part of. All around the world, no matter where you are, you're tied to the polar bear in some way, and our actions have an impact on them. Really, it comes down to getting warmth out of the atmosphere. We've trapped too much heat. So when people learned how to burn fossil fuels for energy, so things like oil, coal, and gas, we release carbon emissions into the atmosphere. And those emissions act like a heat-trapping blanket. They trap heat against the Earth. And in regular amounts, that's not so bad. But we've released rampant amounts into the atmosphere. So we've really thickened that heat-trapping blanket. And I think we've all been in a situation where we're too warm, we're wearing a coat that's too heavy or a blanket that's too thick. And you just can't get rid of that excess heat. And that's basically what our planet is experiencing right now. And I think we all also know that when it's warm outside, say in the summer, and you're trying to have a nice drink, maybe a soda or something, your ice doesn't like it. Of course, ice melts when it gets warm. So that's what's happening to sea ice. We're warming up the atmosphere, and we're starting to lose too much sea ice too quickly. And what we've seen is that we've lost about 13% of ice per decade since late 1970s. What this means, it may not look like a lot, but we've lost millions of square kilometers of ice, and it's going to keep going. So you'll see that it goes up and down and up and down and up and down, but the overall trend is down. And this will continue if we don't do anything. But if we do step in as a planet and as humans, then we can change the trajectory. And it's not just polar bears that care about sea ice. It's not only them. So the seals that they eat also rely on sea ice. The ringed seal, it uses sea ice as a platform to rest on and to give birth on. But more than that, sea ice is to the ocean what soil is to the forest. So sea ice is forming the base of the whole food chain in the Arctic. It's giving life in the Arctic. Within the sea ice itself, algae grows, which is so cool. If you actually look, so sea ice looks white, maybe boring. You look underneath and it can be green and just full of life. It's like a garden, an underwater garden under there. And that garden feeds these little creatures, the diatoms and the copepods that live in the ocean. And those feed the fish, and those feed the seals, which feed the bears. So this ice is really giving life. And people live all across the north and also rely on Arctic sea ice. So people go out on the ice. They also use it to travel on and to find food on. And so when sea ice gets less stable or we lose it, they are losing access to food, which is, of course, a major issue. Many communities in the north don't have access to a grocery store like we do. Or if they do, it's very, very limited. So they really rely on living off the land, and that land is changing. For polar bears, here's kind of the breakdown of what's going on with them. So we're warming the climate. In some areas, sea ice is changing already. And for polar bears, this has a few different things that go along with it. So increased movement. They're actually walking more. As the sea ice thins out and melts, it breaks up more and it moves more. It's like a treadmill. So imagine that you're at home and there's a peanut butter sandwich in your kitchen and you want to get to it because you're hungry. And you start walking toward it and your floor starts acting like a treadmill. And now you're having to expend more energy to get the one sandwich. And by the time you finally reach it, now you're extra hungry and you wish you had 2 sandwiches because you just burned so much energy getting the one that you expected to get. That's kind of what's going on with polar bears. They're expending the same amount of energy to get the same or even less amounts of food in some areas. And in some areas, they're going longer without eating. So in Hudson Bay in Canada, every year the sea ice completely melts and then completely refreezes, and that's normal. But what's happened now is that it's melting for longer. So those polar bears are actually on land a month longer than they used to be just a couple decades ago. And that has a big impact. A month without food, when they lose, we know that they lose about 1 kilogram of body fat a day, so about 2 pounds of body fat a day. So if you add that up over a month, that makes a difference, and then not being able to find food on land. So these are, important changes we're seeing. And with any mammal, any animal, including humans, if you're moving more and you're eating less and you're going longer without eating, you lose weight, but over time you aren't as healthy, period. And for females especially, this means that they have fewer and smaller cubs, which we've also already seen in a couple populations. It's harder to have babies when your body's working harder. Over time, it's harder when you do have cubs to get those cubs up into adulthood. Cubs require a lot of energy and dedication to take care of. And when your cubs aren't making it up into adulthood and you're not having as many, you see a population decline. And we do have some populations that are already experiencing that. So this is a map of the 19 different polar bear subpopulations across the Arctic. If you look at the population kind of right in the middle, the AB, the Arctic Basin, that's the North Pole. So we're looking down on top of the Earth. Now, there's not a lot of polar bears at the North Pole because there's not a lot of seals there. It's not a productive area. It's very dark. But in a lot of areas, you'll notice too, all across Russia and Europe, we're missing a lot of information about polar bears. So they're very hard to study because of where they live. They go out, far, far away from people in horrible conditions for us, really dangerous, really cold. And so they're hard to get to and to understand in a lot of areas. And where we know more about them is where they're more accessible. So Canada has about 2/3 of the world's polar bears. And we know a bit more about many of those populations, so not all. You'll see the populations in red are the ones that have declined. So we've got one in Alaska, the Southern Beaufort Sea, SB. And then WH and SH are Western Hudson Bay and Southern Hudson Bay. And we have long-term data on all these populations. And so we've seen the declines that are happening. Some are still stable, some are doing well. It's important to know that every one of these polar bear populations has a different set of circumstances. So sea ice is changing at different rates across the Arctic. In some areas, people are a much bigger influence in terms of development and shipping and maybe even oil exploration. And in some places, bears don't really need to worry about people much yet. Overall, though, at the end of the day, all these polar bears rely on sea ice. All of them do. And all of them will eventually be impacted by a warming climate if we don't do anything about it. If we don't do anything, if this is what we have now, by the end of the century, we could lose up to 2/3 of the world's polar bears. Now, if we get to that point, we're going to have other issues as well in the Arctic and also with people. So we do not want to get to that point. We want to keep Arctic sea ice stable in the north and keep a very healthy population of polar bears in the north. Once you get down to this many bears, there can be issues with more disease. We also know that pollution is rising in polar bear in their body fat and skin and their hormones. And so they're going to have a lot of extra stresses on them. So we want to keep them as healthy in the wild as we can. It's also important to know that it's not possible for polar bears to adapt to live on land. It's simply changing too quickly. Polar bears evolved over tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of years, and we are seeing changes in decades. And again, polar bears really rely on blubber. And you just don't find blubber anywhere on land. Polar bears, when they are stuck on land, they will eat things like eggs and berries, but those are very, very small number of calories. And polar bear digestive systems actually don't even process proteins and carbohydrates the same way that other bears do. So brown bears and black bears can eat berries and eggs and fish all day long and be great. Polar bears couldn't. Over time, they would really need that fat to keep up with the lifestyle that they have. And we know that they love the fat even more because during the spring, when seals are pupping, having their babies, it's the best time of year to be a polar bear. There's a lot of easy food out there. And if a polar bear has a lot of food available to it, it will actually just go eat seals and strip the blubber off, and it will leave the meat. It won't even eat the protein if it doesn't have to. If it's already feeling pretty satiated, if it feels good and it's got more food, it just wants to eat the fat. So we really don't see that on land again. Polar bears need sea ice. They need to live their life the way they evolved to. So we believe that by better understanding the polar bear, we can better protect it or do a better job of trying to keep those bears in the Arctic while the world changes. So I wanted to just briefly touch on a few of the research projects that Polar Bears International is working on right now. And again, I would love to answer any questions you have about polar bears or research or anything. So one of the projects that we've had running for quite a while now is monitoring moms and cubs. And we have a maternal den cam project. So in Alaska and Norway, we put out sneaky cameras. So when we know where a mom is denning with her brand new babies before they've come out into the world, we will sneak in really quietly. We will put up a camera about 100 meters away, so far enough away it doesn't bother them. And then we'll very sneakily go away so we don't disturb the family at all. And this camera, it's a video streaming camera, so it will stream live when the mom and cubs come out of their den. And it's pretty awesome because you get to see, well, how many cubs are there, how healthy the family is, you get to see what they're doing in front of the den, and you can learn a lot about families. These families are the most vulnerable in the population right now. They're the most at risk of changes. Again, it's really hard being a polar bear mom, so learning more about them is really, really popular. Okay, we've got a question from Bridget. Are the polar bear populations from the map separated by geographic features or family groups? That's a really good question. I'll actually just backtrack right now. I like answering questions during presentations. It breaks up me talking. You know, humans are funny when we're working to manage wildlife populations. It's not always necessarily based on the wildlife itself, but what's easiest for us. So honestly, a lot of these populations are simply what's better politically or through the government system. And that's pretty much it. So they're kind of government based. In the last about 5 years or so, there's been a really big surge of genetic research that's gone on, and we've learned some interesting things about some of the genetics in the population. There are no subspecies of polar bears right now, so we do have subspecies of brown bears, but polar bears right now are just one, though there do seem to be a couple interesting clusters. With that in mind, it may be that some of these population boundaries get adjusted in the future so that we're better managing for genetic diversity. But right now, it really comes down to the different jurisdictions and humans needing to manage kind of what works for them. So it would make sense to break it up in other ways, but that's what we have for now. Okay, so we talked about monitoring mom and cub health. And here's another way that we monitor families and females. So we have been putting out GPS collars on polar bears for several decades now. If you notice that mom in the front there, she does have a collar on. And the GPS technology, it's just the same as maybe your parents had GPS in their car, or maybe you've used it on your phone or other device before. And the collar is something just like you would put on your family dog. It's pretty light compared to the bear itself. And we put those collars on the females for about a year, sometimes up to 2 years. And in this way, we can actually figure out what the bears are doing on the sea ice. So again, polar bears don't really want to be near people. They live in a habitat that is really brutal for us to try to go out on. And so knowing what they're actually doing in their day-to-day life has been nearly impossible for a long time. But with the advances in technology, we've been able to learn so much. So, I'm a biologist, but I have the deepest, utmost respect for the engineers and technologists that actually help us learn more about animals. It takes all different types to find out this sort of knowledge. So the GPS work has actually allowed us to see where polar bears are moving, when they're moving, what type of sea ice they need, how moms with cubs maybe are different than bears without cubs, things like that. But you'll notice I've said that we only track females this way. Females have a slimmer neck compared to their head, whereas male polar bears have a really thick neck compared to their skull, so they kind of have like a cone head. So when you put a collar on a male polar bear, they can slide it off super easy. The females can slide their collars off if they really want to, but it takes a bit more effort, whereas the males will just flick it off, and the males fight more, so the collars will come off. So we only tracked females for quite a long time. If you're interested in seeing where the polar bears are, you can go anytime to the Polar Bears International Bear Tracker. All the bears on kind of the left half there are Western Hudson Bay, and most of them are live collars. So that's where the bears are, like right now, out on the bay. And if you click on the icons, you can learn more about the bear. You can see if she's got cubs, how old she is. So it's pretty cool. I update the map about once a week with a few locations, and you can track bears all winter long, which is pretty cool. So I encourage you to check that out. But we finally do have better technology to track male polar bears, which is super exciting. So again, many years only knowing the female side of things, and when you're really trying to understand a population, it's important that you know the different groups in that population. So we've been able to shrink down the GPS technology and fit it in an ear tag on the polar bear, and it's actually been working really well. Now, these tags don't last quite as long. They last maybe 3 to 6 months, but they're maybe extra important in one way because some of these tags in the fall go out on trouble bears in Churchill, Manitoba. So Churchill, Manitoba has a very famous polar bear holding facility, sometimes called Polar Bear Jail. The town of Churchill is right on the coast, right kind of in the middle of a polar bear migration zone. And so every fall when the bears start moving to the coast waiting for sea ice, there are always some bears that come into town. And there's a group of officers there called the Polar Bear Alert Team. And their job is to keep the people safe and to manage the polar bears without hurting them if at all possible. And they do a very excellent job. Polar bears are really smart. And especially if they learn young, if they figure out how to get somewhere, get into town, for example, and find food, they're probably going to try to do it again in their lifetime. And so there are some bears that come back again and again to towns. They maybe have a nose for garbage or easy food or something. So it's been a problem in the past, but now being able to put GPS ear tags on those males, you can slap on an ear tag, release the bear, and then track it. And so if he comes right back to town, which has happened, you can intercept him before he causes trouble again. So it's both a great tool to understand polar bear behavior and distribution and where they move, but it's also been a good safety tool for communities. So that's a neat piece of technology. This is a not very exciting thing probably, but I think it's very important. Again, as polar bears are spending a long time on land, longer and longer periods, they're looking for food. They're getting hungry, and there are communities all up the coast that share this area with the bears. And polar bears are more likely to come into communities that have garbage or, have good smells. So these are bear-proof bins, bear-proof garbage bins that we're helping fund for northern communities right now for Churchill to test them out. And basically, it's just a way for people to lock up their garbage really securely so that if a bear does come in and try to get some garbage, it does not get rewarded by that garbage, and it will not learn to do that again. We've got a question from Brittany. What is the relationship like between male and female polar bears? That's a good question. So usually there's not much of a relationship. When females have cubs especially, they tend to try to avoid male polar bears at all costs, usually. Male polar bears do occasionally kill the cubs, and so females will try to separate the cubs from them. Male and females only really come together in the spring to mate, and females only mate once every 3 years. So that's mostly the extent of their relationship. Otherwise, they don't really tend to have much to do with each other at all. We do see males hanging out together sometimes when it's a low competition time of year. So in the fall, when they're hanging out on land and there's no food and it's not mating season, males will play together even. We call it sparring. They'll hang out in groups. They'll even kind of like sleep on top of each other like a bunch of dogs. Females don't really tend to do that. They tend to more keep to themselves, and the two genders are pretty split. Thank you for the question. And this is one more project we have going on. We do have other ones we're working on, but I'm just highlighting these because I think they really involve people. This is a radar system we're testing. So it actually started as a military radar system. You can see, I don't know if you can see, so in the top left corner of that screen where it shows the snow and the tundra, there is a polar bear there. And it's really, really hard to see, which is kind of the point. But the surveillance radar picked it up, and it noticed that polar bear coming in. And we think that this could be a really good tool for many communities that do not have a polar bear alert team. This would be able to give us warning before a bear comes in and causes trouble. It could sound a siren. It could send a text message to people, or it could turn a light on, or it could do anything. Those are just some ideas. For one example, if you had a garbage dump in a small northern town, you could have like a light post, and this radar could turn on a red light if it picked up a bear in the area. So people would know, oh, I can't go dump my garbage right now. There must be a bear around. Let's keep the kids inside. And then when the light is green, it's safer to go outside. So those are some ideas we have. We're still testing it, but it might be a good early detection warning system. Hey, more questions. How big are their territories, or do they not really have territories? Yeah, polar bears are not territorial. Because they cover so much land and the spacing of the food is so variable, they don't have really set territories. We notice that bears sometimes tend to have a favorite area, but they'll still move around quite a bit. But their home ranges we can look at year to year. And a home range is kind of like, imagine drawing a circle around all their activity. So for you as a student, maybe think about where your school is and where your home is, and maybe the park or your favorite place to eat or grandma's house, all the places you spend the most amount of your time, and draw a circle around that, and that would be your home range. So maybe you spend the most amount of your time and draw a circle around that, and that would be your home range. So maybe your home range is, 50 square kilometers or something like that. For polar bears, their home ranges can be 500,000 square kilometers. So bigger than, most of the states. Almost the size of France, I think, bigger than France. Big. They cover a lot of land. So imagine trying to protect that amount of sea ice. It just wouldn't be possible. So that's one reason that they're not kind of inherently as aggressive as grizzly bears. Grizzly bears are very territorial, especially the ones that live on the tundra around where polar bears do spend any time on land, because there's not a lot of food. So polar bears are angry, they're hungry, they're defending their territory, and polar bears just aren't as territorial. So they're not territorial, so they're not as aggressive. Though they can cause harm, especially if they're hungry and desperate for food. So we still are very safe in polar bear country. And how long do baby polar bears stay with their mothers? Yeah, about 2.5 years. So cubs are born. We give all cubs a birthday of about January 1st. And then the first whole year of their life, we call them cubs of the year. And then the second year of their life, we call them yearlings. And then for the first, right about now, for another month or two, the 2.5-year-olds will be at their mom. And then this spring, they will be weaned and their mom will look for another mate. So only about 2.5 years. And then when a bear is between 2.5 years old and 5 years old, they're called a subadult. And we kind of can consider those like the teenager bears. They tend to get in the most trouble and do stupid things. And then after 5 years old, they're considered an adult. So I'd like to encourage anyone, to help us with our polar bear conservation message. It really comes down to protecting sea ice is the biggest thing we can do. Sea ice, no matter where you live, is important. So it's not only the northern people that depend on it, it's us as well. Sea ice acts like Earth's air conditioner. It reflects sunlight away from the Earth and prevents it from being absorbed into the ocean. And it has a net cooling effect on the whole planet. So wherever you live, sea ice has a benefit in your life. It is a super cool habitat. It's really important for polar bears, and protecting sea ice is the best way we can protect the bears. And this really comes down to getting that excess warmth out of the atmosphere. So reducing carbon emissions and looking for other solutions. So using more wind and solar energy, reducing the amount of fossil fuels we're burning, finding innovative solutions to even try to pull those carbon emissions out of the atmosphere. We should be, supporting people that are working on that stuff and plugging into community initiatives already going on. And when you're old enough, you can vote for leaders that are pushing ahead and just care about the environment and care about your future. All the young people watching, your choices in your lives are going to add up day after day after day to be huge changes in the world. And so everything that you do that's good for bears is good for sea ice, is good for you and your future in the end, because we're all living on the same planet. If we do nothing at all, we know that we could lose summer Arctic sea ice. We could lose a lot of sea ice by the end of the century, enough so that we could lose quite a few polar bears, but that will not be the only effect. Again, we would throw the whole Arctic ecosystem out of balance. But it's very clear that if we do stick to our targets and if our government leaders do what they promise that they will do, we can make a big change. We absolutely can. We have the technology, we have the solutions, we just need to make sure we're working on them. So we can keep enough Arctic sea ice in the Arctic to keep polar bears there and to help keep our planet cool enough that we can also have a great future. And I just wanted to give a shout out. International Polar Bear Day is on February 27th, so less than 2 weeks from now. It's on a Wednesday. We will be posting all sorts of infographics, memes, facts, fun ideas all over social media and our website that day. We will also have a bunch of Facebook Live events if you'd like to talk to other polar bear researchers or just type us questions anytime. It's going to be just a fun day to celebrate the polar bear. So more questions coming in. Thank you so much. And please, everyone, feel free to chime in with more and more. I'll keep going for a little while here. What is the gestation period of the polar bear, and are the females solitary from other females and males? Yeah, a couple of great ones. So gestation in a polar bear is interesting. They mate in the spring, and if they end up with a fertilized egg or a zygote, it does not implant yet. So they're technically not pregnant, even if they do have a zygote. So they will go through some hormonal changes, though, if they do get that zygote, and they will eat as much as physically possible. And if you ever get the chance to see a pregnant polar bear, it's amazing. They pack on so much fat, their body just goes into like hyperdrive. So polar bears always have, a couple inches of fat to keep them warm in the Arctic, but pregnant females it looks like they're wearing a pair of fat pajamas or something. They get really, really big, and that's really important because they need that energy to sustain themselves. So when it hits fall, as long as the female's fat enough and healthy enough, then the zygote will implant. So she actually goes months being not technically pregnant, and then all of a sudden in the fall, about October, she's pregnant, and then she'll go into her den about maybe a month after that, right around there, and then she only really gestates for a few months. She'll give birth in December or January, and when polar bear cubs are born, they're just tiny. They're, a pound, they're pink, they're helpless, they're blind, they're just little, and then they drink their mother's milk to grow super fast, super big, super fast. So polar bear milk is the fattiest milk that's found on land. So it's about 33% milk fat when the cubs are born. That would be like us drinking whipping cream. So those huge amount of calories help those cubs grow so that when they're about 2 or 3 months old, they'll leave the den and they can use their little legs to try to keep up with mom. So that's kind of the beginning of the lifestyle. Are the females solitary from other females and males? Generally, yeah. So I mentioned before that we see the males kind of hanging out with each other in the fall anyway, when there's nothing to compete over. We don't really see that with females. And I'm not saying it never happens, because we have a lot left to learn about polar bears. But females with cubs tend to keep them away. We have seen family groups, females with cubs, kind of face off with each other. The moms and cubs don't like hang out in a nice mommy and me group or anything. They will stay separate. They kind of like to be on their own. We have seen young females before they're ready to reproduce kind of hang out with the young boys a bit. Again, they're the subadults, the teenagers. They might be more likely to hang out with other bears, but generally we think they're pretty solitary. And we think the males are pretty solitary out on the sea ice too. What are your thoughts on polar bears in captivity? Yeah, so polar bears in captivity, I know it can seem like a tough one because polar bears have huge home ranges, but many captive zoos, they're not all great, don't get me wrong. There's some that are not ideal for polar bears by a long shot. But we do work with zoos at Polar Bears International. We call them our Arctic Ambassador Centers. And if a polar bear has a good setup, they have a water feature, they can go swimming. Their diet is very well managed, and they have keepers that genuinely care about their intellectual stimulation and always giving them new things and challenges. We've seen polar bears be very happy in captivity, especially the ones that are born into captivity and don't know any better. So it really takes a dedicated staff and good facility, but we believe that they can be happy in captivity, and importantly, they can act as a good ambassador for the wild species. Most people in the world will never get to see a polar bear in the wild. We do hear from a lot of people that their love from polar bears came from meeting their local zoo polar bear. And that's where they really grew their appreciation for the species and where they learned a lot about the species. So we think that if a zoo does have a polar bear, it's a responsibility to do well by that polar bear and by wild polar bears, and to educate the public, to have up-to-date current materials, to talk about climate change and the dangers in the wild. And a lot of our zoo partners that we do work with are some of our biggest contributors to wild research. Generally, a lot of the bigger zoos have research funds that they put towards wild species, and we have zoos funding our research all across the Arctic. So I do think zoos do have a place, but I understand the emotion behind polar bears in captivity, especially in certain areas, absolutely. I saw a picture of you and the cubs. What has been your most memorable encounter? Oh, that's a tough one. I've been really lucky to have some cool encounters. I think probably the biggest one that sticks out to me, though, is one of the first encounters that I ever had, maybe the first. So the first polar bear research I ever did was in Churchill, Manitoba, and it was spring work, which not everyone gets to do. I was quite lucky. And the spring work is when you go out in about March and you head out onto the sea ice and you look specifically for moms and cubs to see how the families are doing. And we had gone out in a helicopter looking for families, and we had landed at a certain area. And as we were standing on the sea ice, which is, again, the most amazing habitat, it's quiet, that you can hear the ocean underneath you, and it's cracking. It's so cool. A mom and two brand new cubs, just little, walked by us on the horizon, and they weren't disturbed by us at all. The mom kind of looked at us. They were far enough away we were totally safe, but close enough that we could see them very well. And the cubs just followed their mom, and everything was just so quiet and calm and peaceful, and none of us said anything for a while. We just watched the family walk away. And seeing those little babies in this like crazy harsh environment, it was so cold. It was the coldest I'd ever been in my life. It was my first time in the Arctic. It gave me so much respect for the animal, and I already had, a healthy respect. But I just think they're the most incredible species. And so that first day ever out on the sea ice watching polar bears, I think always stuck with me, and just really wanted I want it to keep going. I think they're very much worth protecting in the wild. Oh yeah, Bridget, I saw something about polar bear invasion of a town in Russia. How can that be prevented? Yeah, it's a tough one. Again, as the sea ice is changing, and we're losing more sea ice, we're going to see more and more polar bears coming into towns, and it's really going to be difficult for both species to adapt. I would not want to be in a town that had to deal with that. So I personally, I don't know all the specifics of the Russia situation. Of course, I'm not there. I've read some news articles. I would need to know maybe a little bit more insider knowledge before I would speak like an expert. My understanding is that there's probably something going on with the sea ice right now. The polar bears who should be out on the ice hunting, this should be an excellent time of year to hunt seals. They're clearly not having access to the type of food they want. And this coastal town has smells, it has garbage, it has food, and that is the #1 thing that polar bears want. And so it seems like polar bears have found out, and they've come into this town to look for calories, to look for food. So it's really difficult to prevent that. I mean, the #1 thing is to keep sea ice protected, which is a long-term struggle, a long-term challenge. In the short term, it's hard. In the short term, we can help provide tools for people to better store their garbage and food so that there's not maybe as many smells and the bears aren't actually finding food, so they move through town rather than hang out around town. And again, we can help provide detection systems. One thing we've also done at Polar Bears International is simply help provide training whenever it's wanted. Like, we'll pay for a trainer to go help train bear monitors and bear guards. There are people in the Arctic that their actual career is being a bear guard, a bear monitor. So their job is to have a gun and go stand outside and look around and keep people safe from bears. So we help support that. It's an important role. So there's no one silver bullet solution. There's a lot of little things we can be doing, and it's going to be something that will evolve over time and something that communities are going to have to continually be aware of. One other thing we've done is I helped create a coloring book for kids that live in polar bear country. So we have a polar bear safety coloring book that teaches, like 4- and 5-year-olds, when you're outside, here's what to do to stay safe. If you see a polar bear, get inside right away, and don't play behind the willows, and don't walk down the alleys, and things like that most kids in the world don't have to worry about. Will be an increasing issue for sure. Is Canada progressive when it comes to environmental causes? What are they doing to help polar bears in the legislature? So Canada is progressive in some ways. I've been proud of the progress over the last few years. We did just implement a carbon tax, which most economists and experts in the field do say that is the best way to move forward with carbon reduction. So it is like a revenue neutral carbon tax, so Canadian citizens will see dividend checks come in from that. So I do think I support the carbon tax. We support that as a way to reduce carbon. Canadians in general, I think, do absolutely care about the environment and want to see environmental protections in place. That said, there's always more we can do. The north is a tough place where I live. We don't have any electric cars where I live. The infrastructure is not here, so that's something we'll be working on. In terms of polar bears, so sometimes polar bears are shot that do come into communities, absolutely. So if a hungry bear is persistent and won't go away, they will be killed. Human lives have to come first. In places like Churchill, where there's a really good infrastructure for dealing with problem bears, so we have a holding facility, we have helicopters that are trained to fly bears out, we have people trained to tranquilize bears and move them. That is where they are able to move away bears without killing any, the vast majority of the time. But many communities all across the north don't have that capability yet, or may never. And so sometimes they do have to kill a polar bear. And so this is another reason that we're very committed to human polar bear conflict reduction. So that's why we're helping fund bear bins. That's why we're working on this surveillance radar. That's why we talk to people about polar bear safety, because we want to keep the wild polar bear population as healthy as possible as the sea ice continues to decline. And we do believe that this issue will get worse over the coming decades, and people need to be supported. These communities absolutely need to be supported. They've got kids, they've got their own lives to worry about. Polar bears don't want to hurt us, but you know, they're hungry and they're wild animals, and we're on their land as well, and we, you know, both species have to try to cohabitate together. So it's just a difficult situation. So we are always working on solutions. We do have our Senior Director of Conservation sits on the international committee to look at human-wildlife, human-polar bear conflict. There's people working on it together from all the polar bear countries, but it's a tough one. We're going to see more of it in the news, I betcha. How are the seal populations doing? Any changes to the sea ice? Or are they doing well because the bears can't hunt them? Yeah. So seals are hard to study. So maybe even harder than polar bears because so much of their life is underwater. In some areas, seals are doing fine. There's so many more of them than the bears. In other areas, we do believe that they are less healthy and maybe have even declined. Where the ice has really changed, for example, there's been some wet years where the caves that the pups are born in have caved in. Some years where the ice just isn't as good and the seals can't make their living on the ice. So it depends on what seal species you're looking at and where, but it absolutely is a concern about how they're doing. And I think we can't really fully understand what's going on with the polar bear until we better understand what's going on with seals. And pollution is something that's a rising concern in the Arctic, and it really, the type of pollution we're worried about is really transferred by fat up the food chain. So the animals that have a lot of fat, the fish, the seals, and the polar bear are getting more and more toxins in them. So we're also worried about that for the seals. Yeah, the picture of the scrawny and sick polar bear, that's a good question. So many of you, was it last year or even 2 years ago, there was this really viral photo of the very, very skinny polar bear starving. That was a tough one to see. It is true that the main mechanism of losing polar bears and polar bear population decline is starvation, and that is what starvation looks like. So it is something that we'll probably see more of over time. However, on a case-by-case basis, it's honestly impossible to say. So that bear could have been really old. Usually when the bears are really old, past their prime, they're hurt maybe. They just aren't hunting as much, and that's often the way they die is they eventually curl up and starve to death. So that does happen in the wild, and it does happen with all other animal populations too. It's not just polar bears. That bear could have broken a tooth or had a broken jaw. We've seen that. When males fight over females in the spring for mating, they are brutal. We have seen horrific injuries on some of these bears. So they will break each other's jaws. They will almost slice each other open with their claws. A lot of times the polar bears recover like miraculously well, but other times they're not going to make it, and that's a reality for wildlife, and some of that at a certain level is totally normal, but we do think that we will see more starvation events over time. But I think it's also important to note that a lot of the starving that will happen we won't see, because again, polar bears are out on the sea ice, and most polar bear bodies and fossils are actually at the bottom of the ocean, so it's hard for us to piece that together. They'll pass on the sea ice and then potentially sink in the ocean before we get to learn more about them. So they're interesting that way. And what species of seals do they go after more? Yeah, that's a really good question. So I might backtrack to my seal slide at the beginning to show you the different types. Here we go. So the seal on the left here, the big one and the little one, those are bearded seals. You can see that that one does have a little bit of a mustache. And the bearded seals are the really big ones. So they can be like a couple 100 pounds. They are huge, and they make a really good meal for a polar bear. But because they are so big, it's usually mostly the males that hunt the bearded seals. Maybe a female can make it happen for the younger ones especially, but for a big adult bearded seal, usually the big male polar bears are getting those guys. But they are rewarded with a hearty meal. The seal that's the most common, though, for our polar bears is the ringed seal. So that's the one on the right here. So they are smaller, 70 to 100 pounds, maybe. No, up to like 150 pounds, I think, actually. Much more doable for female polar bear, for younger polar bears, also for males. Also gives a great meal. So the ringed and bearded are the two main ones, and they're both, we call them ice obligate. So they both do need sea ice. They are ice seals. There are a few other species polar bears will eat, like a harp seal, kind of whatever is available honestly. Occasionally, they might get super, super lucky, depending on the right circumstances, and get something like a baby beluga. Or if a dead whale washes up on shore, that's like a bonanza for polar bears. They will be super excited. That is a ton of blubber. So usually they make their living with the seals. Will they ever go after something like a narwhal or any types of whales? Yeah, I've actually seen, so near Churchill, there's some really shallow rivers that in the summer, beluga they come down from the Arctic and into these rivers to give birth. And there's been a few summers where killer whales have started coming into Hudson Bay, which is a fairly new phenomenon. Killer whales love eating belugas and narwhals. But specifically for beluga, when they're in these rivers, if they sense a killer whale, they will pack up these rivers like crazy. Like it just looks like a sea of white. There's no space between them. It is one of the craziest things I've ever seen. In that situation where beluga cannot escape easily, it's shallow, and a bear's in the right situation, I've seen a polar bear pick off a beluga that way, which it must have been very happy about. So that's one of the occasions. Usually it'd be a little too hard for a polar bear to grab a whale, especially if the whale's too big, the bear just wouldn't be physically capable, but not to say they would never try. We've also, I think maybe some of you have seen there's footage of a polar bear trying to take down a walrus. Well, walrus are massive and have super thick skin, so that wasn't going anywhere, but bears will do what they can to get a meal. If a polar bear is living alone, would it allow another bear to come up and share its meal? That's a really interesting question because we have seen that before. We've seen some video footage and we have photos of that where a polar bear gets a kill and a bear comes in kind of from out of nowhere and wants to help itself. So probably depends. So all bears are individuals. Some are going to be maybe more jerks than others. Some are more sharing than others. But we have seen polar bears share their meals. It might depend on what condition they're in, if it's a male or female, a lot of factors. But we know sometimes they'll share their meal, maybe not all the time. Probably a lot of factors depend on that. So I've been studying polar bears for almost 9 years now. So I've been very focused on Canadian polar bears. Most of my work's been in Churchill, Manitoba, though I have also worked in Tuktoyaktuk in the Northwest Territories in Canada. And I currently live in the Northwest Territories, of course, though much farther south than Tuk. So yeah, it's been really wonderful. I think one of the best things about Polar Bears International is that we're really collaborative. So we are really good at working with other groups. So we ourselves are small, but we work with governments and universities and communities and individuals and other nonprofits to get work done all across the Arctic. And so it's really important that we work together because polar bears, again, it's a global issue and it's a global species in a lot of ways, even though they only live in the Arctic. Okay, so I've got time for a couple more questions. One thing I might tell you guys about, you might be interested in, I don't know if anyone has ever heard of the growler bear. This is a hybrid bear species that was seen in the high Arctic of Canada years ago now, maybe 8 years ago now. Hunters were out and they saw this bear that they just had never seen before. Super bizarre. Long story short, because it is a long story, this went on for years. People didn't know what was going on. Other growler bears were seen. We were wondering if it was like an epidemic of growler bears. Turns out there was one female polar bear up north who seemed to have a thing for grizzly bears. We don't really know why. But over the years, she mated with 2 different grizzly bears and had cubs. So we had these hybrid growler bears, and those growler bears were fertile, which isn't always the case with hybrids. So that means that they can also have babies. So those growler bears mated with the same brown bears, so the same ones their mom were interested in, and had another generation of growler bears that were 3/4 brown, 1/4 polar. So it was a super interesting situation, but it ended up being quite isolated. It was this one little family tree. We don't know if there are any left in the wild. We haven't seen more since, but we're keeping an eye out for it. Genetically, super interesting. They kind of look like this creamy polar bear and had dark circles around its eyes. Its feet were kind of like a mix between polar bear feet and grizzly bear feet. Polar bears have really long claws and grizzly bears have grizzly bears have longer claws and polar bears have these thick, sharp claws for piercing seals. And the claws were like kind of in the middle. Anyway, it was a super weird bear. If you look it up online, there's some really cool pictures, but it's an interesting fact about grizzly bears and polar bears that I thought was kind of cool. What would you suggest for students wanting to go into this type of field? Yeah, that's a really good question. I would say there is not one path to polar bears, and there's not one path to anything you're passionate about, actually. So if it's biology specifically you're interested in, I would say, keep on top of your sciences. It's really important if you want to continue going. But in science, we need people that are also good communicators. So we need good writers. We need people that are comfortable speaking to audiences. We need people that can just communicate ideas. One of the biggest issues with scientists sometimes is that they're like, he's so brilliant, come up with these great ideas and have these amazing results, but then you can't really tell anyone about it. So being able to work on your communication and also your science and just being a well-rounded student, I think, is important. You don't have to be amazing in any one aspect, but just work on it. And the biggest thing is probably just work hard and be one aspect, but just work on it. And the biggest thing is probably just work hard and be pleasant to work with. I think that's the biggest one. Look for opportunities, volunteer where you can, make good impressions as long as you go anywhere. People who show up early and just work hard and are fun, those are the people that honestly get the most opportunities and get to do the coolest stuff. And if you don't like something, that's totally fine. Change something up. Don't be afraid to change your mind. But yeah, definitely just work hard and follow what you're passionate about. I never in a million years thought I would end up studying polar bears at all. I didn't even see one until I was in my 20s. So you never know. And people that work for Polar Bears International come from an English background, a women's studies background, skiing, social media, photography. We've got all sorts of people that have kind of come together to work on polar bears. So it could come from anywhere. And like I mentioned too, we need engineers. We need people that are really good at technology and computers that are helping us push the boundaries of what we can learn about animals. Absolutely. What did the growler bears eat? Yeah. So we don't really know what the growler bears ate. Good question. We figured that they would eat seals because their mom was a polar bear, and mom would teach them how to hunt seals. Anecdotally, we think that the hybrids actually ended up more on land and were eating more land foods. We're not really sure why. Maybe they weren't all that well suited to the sea ice with their weird genetics, so they actually did try to stay on land more. There's a lot we don't know about what went on. We have a few samples, some photos, some stories. That's about it, but super fascinating, and maybe it'll be something that happens more often. Maybe not. We're not really sure yet. It was a pretty unique situation. Yeah, so science is super awesome. Thank you, Lynn. If anyone has one last question, feel free to fire away. Otherwise, I think we are at the top of the hour. I've talked for almost an hour now. I sure appreciate everyone's time. It's been wonderful chatting about polar bears, Arctic sea ice, and what to do, what we can all do together. I would encourage you to check out the polarbearsinternational.org website for all sorts of resources, the Bear Tracker, and to learn more about International Polar Bear Day coming up in a couple weeks, which is going to be super, super fun, and we want as many people to participate as possible. There's also online resources for students and teachers, so lessons, mini posters, fun activities, all sorts of stuff. We have it if you're interested in it. And there's also a place to reach out if you have follow-up questions. Reach out to us and we'll get back to you as soon as we can with questions about polar bear biology or what we do or anything like that. We're happy to chat with you. Great. So thank you all so much. I guess we'll sign off. It's 3:01. Thank you also to the National Biodiversity Teach-In in Elgin High School. I think this is a really great program and super fun to do and chat to people from all over about stuff we care about. So cool. Thanks, everyone. I'll let everyone sign off, but I'll hang out here for a couple more minutes just in case.